What's going on, Steelers Nation? Welcome back to the channel. I wanted to hop on here today and talk about one particular pre-draft visit that we got confirmed yesterday at the Washington Pro Day. It's been reported that quarterback Michael Penix is going to take a top 30 visit to Pittsburgh to visit with the Steelers. I wanted to talk about this for several reasons. One, the Steelers haven't shown a ton of interest in quarterbacks so far this cycle. They redid the entire quarterback room. All three quarterbacks from last year, Pickett, Trubisky, and Rudolph all moved on. They've since brought in Russell Wilson, traded for Justin Fields, and then recently signed Kyle Allen. So, complete makeover in the quarterback room. But to this point, outside of like really just seeing these guys at the Senior Bowl, there wasn't much reported interest at the combine. We talked about that on the channel. Today, I kind of wanted to talk about the reason why I think they may be looking at this visit, the visit in general, and then I also want to get like real deep into the weeds on a scouting report for Michael Penix because I have a lot of thoughts on him. He's a very interesting player, and a lot of people on Twitter have been asking me about like what I think about him as a prospect or as a player. So, going to go over all those things, strengths, weaknesses, kind of my grade or projection, how I see his game translate to the next level. Just before we get started, please make sure that you like the video, subscribe, drop me a comment, all that good stuff. Helps support the channel. I think the reason for the visit, obviously, I think the Steelers are comfortable with their quarterback room as it stands right now. But I do think it's worth noting that, as of this recording, the Steelers do not have a quarterback that is signed to the roster for next season. Now, I think that there is a good chance that either Russell Wilson or Justin Fields will be back in Pittsburgh next year. We'll have to see how things play out, man. We're looking at two guys that are really looking forward to, proving guys wrong or their previous franchises, the Bears, the Broncos wrong, and elevating their career or reviving their career, I guess, in Russell Wilson's standpoint. So I don't think that you can completely ignore that. Now, a pre-draft visit does not necessarily mean the Steelers are going to take Penix, right? Like that's not what that means. However, I do think that it's worth noting that the Steelers' first 4 draft picks from last year all visited the Steelers before the draft. So there is like the Steelers have a history, particularly on day 2 of the draft, to taking guys that they visited extensively with. Joey Porter Jr., Broderick Jones, Darnell Washington, and Keanu Benton all had pre-draft visits with the Steelers last year. And they also had a visit with Darius Rush, who they ended up signing after he was released. So kind of interesting. Penix is the consensus 37th ranked player on the consensus board, kind of floating around that top 50 range. So he's probably going to go sometime on day 2. But I wanted to talk about his game in general because I know he's everybody loves the quarterback discussion as we've seen in Pittsburgh over the past several months. So let's kind of get into his scouting report. Penix is a 6-year senior. He turns 24 a couple weeks after the NFL draft. He's a quarterback that started his career at Indiana. He actually started games as a sophomore there. There's actually a game that I remember. It's kind of funny that everything comes full circle. 2019 against Ohio State, against Justin Fields. He had a big time back and forth with him. He ended up throwing for almost 500 yards and 5 touchdowns in a really close game. They ended up losing, but that was kind of my introduction to him as a player in terms of, okay, this dude's got some serious talent. He dealt with a bunch of injuries in Indiana, which we could talk about, and then ended up transferring to Washington. And really, since that happened 2 years ago, Penix has been one of the most, really lethal quarterbacks or passers in college football. In 2023, he threw for 4,900 yards, 36 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. Ended up leading Washington all the way to the national championship game that they would eventually end up losing to Michigan. But a fantastic season, career for Penix, really revived it in Washington. Penix, like I said, had his pro day yesterday. He notched a 4.53 40 time. Of course, though, all pro day times are kind of like unofficial, but that's what scouts pretty much had him at, was between 4.53 to 4.56. 36.5-inch vertical and a 10.5 broad jump. Both of those, I believe, would have been the best at the combine in Indianapolis. Explosive testing numbers, definitely good things. I think, he said that he had something to prove in terms of his athleticism. He went out there and, he put some people on notice, I think, with that. In terms of the strengths on Penix's scouting report, man, like you got to start with the arm. Extremely confident passer, almost like borderline arrogance with his arm. I feel like at his core, he's really a big game hunter. He wants to throw the ball and push the ball down the field all over the place. He can, make every single throw, and he fully believes in himself that he can do that. But throwing the ball vertically is really where like he excels. You just look at some of the numbers last season, 44% completion rate on throws over 20 yards down the field. really good numbers, but 37 big time throws, just consistently giving receivers a chance to make plays. Allowing, Washington had some really good playmakers, three receivers on that roster that are going to end up as like top 75 players on my big board. Jalen Polk, Roma Dunze, and Jalen McMillan. But aside from like Joe Milton, Tennessee quarterback, I think he's probably got the longest driver of any eligible quarterback. There's more that goes into arm strength than just how far you can throw a football. There's a lot more that goes into playing quarterback than that. But if in terms of just the depth that he can reach with his arm, it's in the elite category. But in terms of like, his arm strength, very, very good arm strength, probably borderline elite, in my opinion, can absolutely rip throws on a line with just a flick of the wrist. He is very upper body dominant, so he doesn't use a lot of like lower body in terms of his throwing motion or mechanics, but he can still make hole shots look extremely easy. He has huge hands. I want to say over 10 inches, spins it effortlessly. You watch this dude throw the ball. I mean, it's a pretty ball with a lot of spin, a lot of velocity. In terms of like how he operates, he wants to operate on time and within the structure of the offense. Like he is a prototypical, what people would call as like a pocket passer, a drop back passer. And then one of the things that I really liked about him is despite operating in a really vertical passing game, that took a lot of deep shots down the field. That's the way the offense was designed. He just didn't take a lot of sacks, man. There's a lot of discussion about how much pressure to sack ratio or rate matters in terms of draft prospect. Have we swung one way too far in terms of that scope or conversation? But 7.6% of his pressures became sacks last season. I mean, that's by far the best in the class. I mean, there's guys that's going to go in the first round that are up around the 20% range. Avoiding those negative plays, it's a significant part of what makes him a valuable quarterback. He just was able to consistently operate on time, and not just him operating on time within the structure of the offense, but keep the Huskies offense out of those third and long, second and long situations. Cause we know how that kind of affects the flow of the game. You take sacks, typically sacks and drives, and, he just didn't take very many. So kudos to him. I really think that beyond that 2019 game against Ohio State, I think the other game that really stands out to me in terms of, being really impressive was the Texas game in the playoffs. He was just absolutely absurd. I mean, it was a heat check type of fire symbol type of game for him. Really just dominant performance. Basically everything that you wanted to see from him as a prospect, he did it. I think that you saw, obviously the arm stands out pretty much anytime that you watch him. The deep ball throws stand out every time that you pop on his tape. But I thought that you showed, the toughness. Of course, that's a big part of his game as well. But just the anticipation, the arm strength, there were even a couple quick movement plays in the pocket that I can remember of, free rushers coming up the A or B gap and him just having those quick twitch movements to step up in the pocket and make big throws down the field. Though, like that's a big part of playing quarterback, dealing with pressure. And he was just fantastic. And I think also that kind of speaks to him, right? Like having one of his best games in the biggest moment to lead his team to a college football championship is it's definitely notable on his scouting report. Now, in terms of some negatives before we kind of get to like a final grade, I think the injury history is worth bringing up. He did get good. It seems like he got mostly good reviews, and all of his like medicals came back good at the combine. We have no reports about like teams being extremely scared off or him being removed from certain teams' boards. Although I'm sure that probably is happening, but it doesn't seem like a widespread opinion. It seems like he's got a good bill of health going into the NFL draft. But he's had 2 ACL tears. He also had a separated AC joint at Indiana. So this was a dude that was really the reason that he moved on. There was just like his inability to stay healthy, finish games, finish seasons. Unfortunately, kind of stunted his development a little bit. His accuracy, I feel like, can best be described as like hot and cold. It's inconsistent. But even like when he's on, I feel like he's what I would refer to as like more accurate than precise. And really the difference between those two things is like accuracy is more like people will point to accuracy as like a completion percentage, right? Are you getting the ball to the receiver in terms of him being able to make the catch? He's accurate because he's always, even on those deep shots down the field, he's always going to give his receivers chances to go up and make those 50-50 contested balls that we saw like Roma Dunze make a ton of at Washington, right? Now, the difference between being accurate and precise to me is there are times where, even when there are completions, it's more so of the result of, his receivers bailing him out on throws behind or 50-50 contested balls that are like either underthrown or, he's misinterpreting the leverage of the defender. So there are some things like that, that in terms of like minimizing yards after catch, where he's more just accurate in terms of like not necessarily as precise. Um, just moving on, like in terms of like his processing ability, there are some fulfilled reads in Washington's offense, but it's a very unique offense. And I think that, his lack of touch over the middle of the field was definitely something that kind of gave me a little bit of pause. He doesn't go over the middle of the field very often. And when he did, I felt like, there were some issues in terms of him trying to change the speed of the ball. So he is like a one speed thrower right now. He's a line drive, straight velocity speed thrower. But when he's asked to kind of layer those throws over linebackers or in between linebackers and safeties or end zone coverage in particular over the middle, that's not really his game right now. That's definitely something that I feel like that he can still hopefully develop, down the line. But the Washington ecosystem was extremely sound. Their offensive line was fantastic the last 2 years. And it was a big part of like keeping him upright, but also keeping him healthy. Right. But I did notice, like, especially in 2023, I felt like anytime that he was pushed off his spot outside of the Texas game, there was just issues in terms of like how he would operate when he would receive quick pressure, in terms of his response time to dealing with pressure, navigating through muddy pockets. He is a guy that kind of, when you keep him clean, that's where he's going to be his best. He operates best when he has a really nice, clean pocket to kind of step into. Um, but when things get murky in the pocket, I felt like he really struggled to kind of navigate those waters. And that's definitely a big kind of concern for me in terms of going to the next level. I'll kind of explain why that is. But, he's a pocket passer, not a runner. And I don't necessarily think that you need to be a runner to be a successful NFL quarterback, even in today's day and age, where we're seeing some more of these premium type athletes take snaps under center. But the biggest issue for me in terms of like his projection is just, he's just not an overly creative player. Like he's not a overly creative thrower. He's not an overly creative playmaker. And I think that really that shows up again, like when he is asked to kind of make those out of structure or second reaction plays. It's just really not what he does best. It kind of seems like everything kind of just, goes haywire a little bit when he receives pressure in those moments. So the lack of creation capacity is something that I'm worried about. In terms of like just bottom line, man, like Michael Penix, like one of those players that I'm absolutely like rooting for more than most prospects, maybe more than anyone in this draft class. I think his story of perseverance through adversities, honestly inspiring at all these levels, man. Like I've been listening to like other people talk about him just over the course of the season, huge season that he had. Like Washington was the only school that was really even interested in him after Indiana. Like this dude was like, you talk about being written off, like he was completely written off, kicked to the curb, completely forgotten about, despite having a little bit of success or flashes at Indiana. And Washington ended up taking him on, and like he proved so many people wrong. And I'm rooting for him to do that at the next level. I feel like if Penix was born in the early 2000s, man, he'd have been a top 10 lock, like no doubt. If he was healthy and, everybody was comfortable with his body, he's a top 10 lock because, like I said, he is a throwback type of pocket passer who loves to throw the ball down the field. Now, the problem with that is there's just not a lot of quarterbacks or offenses in general at the NFL level right now that are playing this style of ball. It's just with the rise of, too high safety looks and just how much quick passing game is implemented in today's NFL offenses. Like that's just not how teams play. And like, I think if you're drafting him, obviously you want to construct an offense around his skill set, but it's he plays such a volatile play style because his strengths are all, pretty much centered around like the deep passing game and pushing the ball down the field vertically, which you love. But just like the underneath passing game, the operating on time with quick game and stuff like that, with his accuracy not being precise, it does kind of have some restrictions there. But ultimately, I gave him a early third round grade as a developmental quarterback with a potential starter upside. The arm talent for me is absolutely the real deal. And that alone really to me is like, it's worth taking a chance on, especially at that point in the draft. But I'd be very concerned if I was taking a guy like Michael Penix and putting him behind any type of offensive line that wasn't described as like stellar. So I think of some quarterbacks that have came out that have really required this type of, kind of environment or ecosystem up front. I think of like Jalen Hurts. Like he had some, like Hurts was obviously, he's not a scrambler, but he's a runner. but he's also like not a very creative thrower. But he's a guy who, like, in college, I felt like really needed to go to a spot with a really good offensive line, and like he went to Philly, and they've had a lot of success. Now, obviously, Hurts is a completely different story. I had a second round grade on him, and that was a lot because like he could be like he was such a powerful runner, and like you've seen them use stuff like that. But I kind of think like that's the kind of offensive line that he's going to need early on in terms of like him even be able to keep his head above water. He's just not going to have the type of pockets in the NFL that he did at Washington. That's just the reality of it. Now, I do think, like I said, arm talent is a big part of the quarterback evaluation. Like his arm strength is excellent, and that alone to me is like worth taking on day two. Just in terms of like, all right, let's just try to develop this dude and try to see what else he can do beyond just really throw the deep ball and stuff like that. Get him to throw in the middle of the field a little bit more, see if there's more to that, more meat on the bone, as like Mike Tomlin would say. But if you're, I think back to this quote too about like Bruce Arians, like a big fan of Penix, and it's not surprising at all. And I think that's why I like watching Penix, is because I grew up, watching, the early Steelers. I think of when Arians was in Pittsburgh with Ben throwing the ball vertical, all that stuff. Like, it's not a surprise that Arians loves Penix, because that's the type of offense that Penix would really thrive in. But he said, as far as football goes, or as far as football grade, I love Penix because he does things I love to do. He puts the ball up the field. He's as accurate on throws up the field as anyone I've seen in the last 15 years. Just to fight through that game the way he did after his ankle tore up. But what he did to Texas was unbelievable. He's referring to the Michigan game, and he played extremely well against Texas. Like I said, the Michigan game was a little bit of a pause because I thought that you really saw a lot of his blemishes in his scouting report show up against like an NFL style defense in Michigan, a scheme or system that's going to be run in probably a half dozen defenses around the league next year. Very similar to like what Mike McDonald did with the Ravens, changing the picture post snap, a lot of sim pressure looks, all that stuff, non-traditional stuff. But how he processes post snap is going to be key to his development. But overall, love the arm. There's a lot of things that I like, mentally, like from an intangible perspective, just the toughness that goes along with Penix. I'm really rooting for him to be successful. As far as if he lands up on the Steelers or not, I have no idea. I think it's an interesting discussion. Penix could go as high as, maybe. I mean, he could go maybe as high as like 7 or wherever the Raiders pick. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if somebody did take a chance on him in the first round. Quarterbacks always like kind of get that half round or full round bump up from, just because the reality of the position. It's a premier position. Everybody's searching for quarterbacks, man. So they always go higher than maybe like they probably should. Based on their film grade, but I could see a team like falling in love with his intangibles and the arm. But I think that realistically, I think he probably goes somewhere in like the early, like second round for maybe one of these teams in the top 10 that aren't able to secure like one of the big four quarterbacks. And maybe they roll the dice on Penix in day two. But I appreciate you guys tapping in with me. I think if the Steelers were to take Penix, they probably have to take him at 51. I don't see him getting to the third round, but you never know. Like with a guy like this, with the injury history and stuff, like we just really don't know what these NFL teams are going to think about him. At 51, I wouldn't necessarily hate it. The Steelers obviously have bigger needs. I get taking a gamble on a quarterback. I would feel more comfortable in the third round though, or with some type of trade back scenario. But the arm is enough investing in. He would be a really fun player to watch and just see what kind of other stuff you can kind of extract from his game. Thank you guys so much for watching the channel. Support all month long has been crazy. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to bring you guys even more NFL draft content, Steelers content leading up to the draft. I got some big plans for draft weekend coming up that I'm excited to share with you guys in the coming weeks. Just make sure on your way out, like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. Drop me a comment. Let me know what you guys think about Penix. Do you guys want to see the Steelers draft the quarterback? And then if so, like who would y'all like to see them go after? But I appreciate you guys. Peace.